Well, what a wonderful sight before me. I'm still aiming for 100 at every meeting, and I'm more than sure we're there this evening, so that makes it 3 in a row, which is a great start to 2008. But I have no doubt that the appeal of Emeritus Professor Trevor Wilson has played a large part in a great turnout tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce Trevor and to ask him to present his paper, From Phoney War to Battle of Britain to Where. As we publicised in the newsletter, Trevor was born in New Zealand. He was educated at Auckland University and Oxford University. He was a lecturer in the History Department of Adelaide University from 1960 and Professor from 1960 to 1993. He is now Emeritus Professor of History and a Research Fellow. Trevor is the author of 7 books on the First World War, the most notable in his view being The Myriad Faces of War. 4 of his books were co-authored with Robin Pryor. Currently he is researching issues relating to 1940 in particular. Trevor has recently celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary and has 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. So Trevor, we look forward very much to From Phoney War to Battle of Britain to Where.
I have to say that this talk is not a South Australian talk, and looking through that very impressive list of topics which you're receiving this year, I feel a bit of a fraud in being here. However, I guess there is one sense in which this is a topic of concern to a South Australian history group, that it deals with events which were followed with bated breath in South Australia, as of course in the rest of Australia and the rest of Antipodes. As firmly as in 1914, Australians believed that the survival of Britain in 1940 was fundamental to their continued independence and self-government. And 1940 posed alarming questions about whether or not Britain and its Commonwealth would survive. Okay. Give me a signal if it's not working. The coming of the new year on the 1st of January 1940 was an uncharacteristic time. The large nations of Europe were at war, as they had not been for the preceding 20 years. So, in a sense, one's mind had to go back to the period 1914 to 18. Yet this was hardly like that. Then, territory had been invaded in Western Europe from the outset, and casualty rates had been savage. In 1939-40, by contrast, the soldiers of France and a mounting, even though still smallish, number of Britons stared at us in hostility at the enemy across the Franco-German frontier, but the boundaries remained the same as they had been when the war began, and no massive fighting was occurring there. That was fine as far as the British and French were concerned. As France had shown when the German army had taken off to the Eastern Front and engaged the Poles at the beginning of the war, a battle which continued for only 1 month, the French had no wish to win the war by launching huge military offensives and suffering the savage rate of casualties of the previous conflict. They enjoyed an impregnable set of fortresses on the border between France and Germany, and they had some of their most skilled troops in the north to enter Belgium as well as soon as that ridiculous country let them come in. Belgium had been in alliance with the French from 1918, but in 1936 the King of the Belgians had reneged on the association between them and had declared complete neutrality. Fat lot of good it was going to do them. Britain also held to the view that they would win this war largely without fighting on land. Their illusion went back again to World War I. No one in Britain virtually, with a handful of exceptions, took a good view of the British military command from 1914 to 18. If you think that denigration of the British military leaders was purely a view held on the left of politics, particularly among pacifists, I assure you, you are wrong. If you want to check on this, read Arthur Bryant's English Saga. And in my youth, everyone read Arthur Bryant. His portrait of Sir Douglas Haig as as devastatingly hostile as any could be. So how had the First War been won? It had been won by the British fleet, who had maintained a blockade on Germany, which, after 3 or 4 years, had so reduced Germany economically that it could not go on fighting the First World War. That view, I'm certain, is absolutely specious, but it nevertheless was believed, and it suited the rulers of Britain to cling to it. The notion that they would not be sending huge armies to their death, as had happened in the First World War. The British fleet ruled the waves. The recent self-destruction of the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee in South America, was evidence enough that the British fleet could deal with the German vessels, and that as long as they ruled the seas, it was only a matter of time before the German economy had to collapse under the weight of war. Hence a sort of armed truce had settled on Europe. Britain seemed almost tardy about pressing on with its military preparedness. Its navy, of course, as I said, ruled the high seas, and the military conscription of males, which had been instituted back in April 1939, before the war had even broken out, was proceeding. But as in peace, pacifist agitation continued and unemployment remained high, a fair indication that the British government was not turning its major efforts to the business of waging war. As for the evacuation of children from the big cities, 800,000 without parents and 500,000 small children with their mothers had indeed been evacuated at the outbreak of the war. But by early 1940, this whole process had gone into reverse. The vast bombing campaigns of which there had been such terrifying predictions had not occurred. The expected bombers had not come, so the need to flee their homes had proved unnecessary. Moreover, the social gulf between children from the slums and their better behaved hosts in the countryside had become really quite exaggerated. And so by early 1940, some 80% of the evacuees had simply packed up and gone home. In other ways, the war did impose itself on Britain. Petrol rationing had been instituted, and so had food rationing. Though both were pretty modest initially, everything would of course change as the war went on, and food rationing never applied to bread or to vegetables. More potent and inconvenient was the blackout, which caused much death and injury to motorists and pedestrians. One prominent victim was the then well-known historian H.A.L. Fisher, and the vigour of people imposing the blackout rendered them a great deal of hatred among the community. Further, the BBC was changed. Britain had instituted the first television programme in the world. It stopped in no time at all once war broke out. And the radio stations, but the BBC had provided a number of services, suddenly only one was broadcasting, the Home Service, until, that is, the government decided to institute a service for their forces in France, which very rapidly became extremely popular with the folks at home as well, and produced well-remembered programmes like the Brains Trust, if you were serious, and Tommy Handley's Itmar, if you weren't serious. That was the phony war. And then, in two dramatic actions by Germany and won by Britain, the whole world changed. On the 9th of April, German forces overran Denmark and invaded Norway. The British and French had, of course, been nursing plans to make some intervention against Norwegian neutrality by sowing mines off the Norwegian coast within Norwegian territorial waters so as to force the German ships that were carrying iron ore from Sweden to Germany would be forced to get outside Norwegian territorial waters and so be subject to the depredations of the British fleet. But what the Germans chose to do was very different. By the use of land, sea and air forces, including paratroopers, they planned to overrun the whole of these two Scandinavian powers. That ran absolutely contrary to all perceptions of what was possible, namely that no German assault was possible in the face of British naval superiority. Yet by midday on the 9th of April, the Germans had overrun Denmark utterly and had seized military control of some of Norway's major towns like Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik. The Allied response proved to be slow in coming, poorly equipped and badly organised. By the end of April, despite some success in naval action against the Germans, the Allies had been expelled from southern Norway and were fighting to regain control at Narvik in the north. That setback led to the second of the three major events, a violent upsurge in the British Parliament. Clear signs of what might happen had been given evidence of back in September when the war was breaking out. To many in the House of Commons, the slowness of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, to announce that Britain was at war was not to be attributed to the attempts of Chamberlain to arrange a joint declaration of war with the French. It might be indication of something else, that he was once more trying to play the appeasement card, as he had done at Munich when an ally of Britain was simply sold down the river to the Germans with disastrous consequences. So it was feared that he might be trying to pull off something again in which Poland would be sacrificed to buy a few months of peace. So, as Arthur Greenwood, acting leader of the Labour Party, rose in the House of Commons to reply to a not very inspiring speech from Neville Chamberlain, a voice ran out from the Conservative backbenchers, the voice of Leo Amery, an imperialist right-wing Conservative. "Speak for England, Arthur." A clear indication that in his view that was not what the Prime Minister had just done. Now on the 7th of May 1940, Amery would speak again, and this time he'd speak for himself. He was a poor orator who was well known for emptying the House of Commons, and anyway, the House of Commons wasn't particularly full when he began his remarks. But Clement Davies, a rather regarded Liberal MP, rushed out into the eating places and the lobbies and urged people to come in, that they were going to hear something important. So that by the time Chamberlain reached his climax, which according to his autobiography he only decided to use at the last moment, the House of Commons was pretty full. He concluded his words with some words spoken or allegedly spoken by Oliver Cromwell to the Long Parliament. "You have stayed here too long for any good you have been doing. Have done with it, I say, and get you gone. In the name of God, go." For a Conservative backbencher to speak to his own government in those terms was obviously being, laying it down where it was. And Amory was not alone. The government was also lambasted by a telling, if somewhat ambiguous, speech from the war leader of the previous conflict, David Lloyd George, paying back, many people felt, a grudge that he had against Neville Chamberlain that went all the way back to 1917. But it also came from Sir Roger Keyes, a man with a large, if scarcely justified, reputation for his activities in the First World War, when he had supposedly done triumphant and significant things at the Dardanelles and at Zeebrugge. He was a pretty dismal speaker also, but he made up for this deficiency by wearing his full naval uniform with all his medals attached. So at least he looked good, even if he didn't sound all that terrific. The next day, Herbert Morrison led the attack. He was a Labour MP whose strength was in London, and he announced that the opposition would divide the House. Chamberlain, in reply, made an impassioned appeal to his friends in the House of Commons to support him. His friends, it needed to be remembered, by this time included Winston Churchill, who, having been on the back benches throughout the whole of the 1930s, had been given his old post of First Lord of the Admiralty when this war broke out. And probably the most convincing speech in Chamberlain's defence was from Winston Churchill, though whether in the personal circumstances it did Chamberlain much good may be wondered. In the division which took place on that day, Chamberlain still had a secure majority. 281 members voted for him. But his majority was only 81. There were 200 against him. And that was a fall from a majority which had always been up in a couple of hundred. And it was well noted that there were among the voters against something like 40 Conservative MPs, most of them, if we're to believe Hugh Dalton, young men in uniform, and it was also noted there a considerable number of Conservatives who did not vote on either side. When the election result was announced, the cry went up, "Resign, resign," and Chamberlain left the House of Commons looking a shattered man. A change of government clearly could not be avoided, and that was reinforced when the leaders of the Labour Party made it clear that they would enter a coalition wartime government, but not one led by Chamberlain, whose role as the prime architect of appeasement, though it is sometimes rather admired nowadays, was in 1940 a millstone round his neck. The choice of Chamberlain's successor, it is usual to claim, lay between Winston Churchill and Lord Halifax. Churchill had been Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, but throughout the 1930s he had been a backbencher and outsider who had not won universal praise for his denunciations of Mahatma Gandhi and his support for King Edward VIII in his rather unusual marital activities. The other possible choice was Lord Halifax, at that time Foreign Minister. Now, Halifax admittedly had been a strong supporter of the now discredited appeasement policy towards Germany, which Churchill in the second half of the 1930s had roundly condemned. But Halifax had powerful supporters among the Conservative leadership, among the Conservative rank and file, and not least in royal circles. It was no secret that King George VI strongly supported him. Hence, there has since been much talk about Halifax as the man who almost got the war leadership at this point. But before you take that too seriously, I draw your attention to the evidence which, with no such intention, demolishes that whole notion of events. The diaries of J.R. Colville, a young diplomat of moderate right-wing views, who at the outbreak of the war had become personal private secretary to Neville Chamberlain. Late in April 1940, as Chamberlain's situation started to deteriorate, Colville wrote with concern about a difference of opinion that had developed between Chamberlain as Prime Minister and Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty. That worried him especially because, as he wrote, the country thinks Churchill is the man of action and don't realise how harmful much of his energy is proving. The next day, Colville noted that the Churchill problem was still to the fore and that Chamberlain was wisely humouring Churchill, and I quote, whose position in the country is quite unjustifiably unassailable. In other words, we're not hearing the opinion of anyone who's a friend of Churchill or anyway inclined towards him. The next day, with the fiasco in Norway becoming quite evident, Colville observed that if Norway went seriously wrong, then a popular outcry might force the reconstitution of the government, and that Churchill, who was so much to blame for all that had gone wrong in Norway, would ride triumphantly forward on a wave of undeserved national popularity. On the 10th of May, learning that Halifax had simply declined to be considered as the next Prime Minister, Colville wrote that if Chamberlain had to go, and I quote, "I'm afraid it must be Winstone. Unless, that is, the King could persuade Halifax to change his mind. Churchill, he said, might be a man of drive and energy, the man that the country thought him to be, but he was a terrible risk. Everybody here is in despair at the prospect." That night, with the game well and truly off, Colville and his colleagues drank champagne to the King over the water, by which he did not mean some obscure descendant of King James II of England. He was talking about Neville Chamberlain. Am I alone in thinking that all this talk of Halifax becoming Prime Minister because the King persuaded him to change his mind is the most arrant nonsense? What we're viewing here is a change of British Prime Minister demanded by the House of Commons and much more by the nation at large. That British foreign policy had been, it was now realised, disgracefully conducted in the late 1930s, when such huge concessions had been made to Adolf Hitler in response to his threats. Now the war was being conducted absolutely lamentably. The country needed a change, and it couldn't just be Tweedledum replacing Tweedle, whatever the other one is. The politicians who carried it out had no shred of choice in face of the realities of the time. If by some skullduggery Halifax had received and accepted the call to become Prime Minister, what would have followed? People don't seem to look at that. A Halifax government without Churchill, it would scarcely have lasted 5 minutes. A Halifax government with Churchill would have become in no time at all a Churchill government, because he was the only person that gave the country the feeling that, with all his shortcomings, his foolish support for Edward VIII, his irresponsible denunciations of Mahatma Gandhi, he had one thing in his favour, and it was the only thing which at that moment mattered. It's interesting in this context to notice a conversation which Churchill had with Colville the following December, by which time the ambassadorship in Washington was vacant and Churchill was trying to press Halifax to take the post. In Britain, he pointed out the monthly censorship reports showed Halifax to be highly unpopular and inheriting the criticism previously heaped on the now deceased Neville Chamberlain. Halifax, Churchill affirmed, has no future in this country. He would never live down the reputation for appeasement with both he and the War Office had won for themselves. Well, if you remember, probably the most popular book published in Britain in 1940 was one called Guilty Men that was published in July, and I have an August edition which was the 19th republication of it. You do see that it was a rather popular book. Perhaps it was irresponsible, perhaps it misstated history, but it said something that people were wanting to hear, that the guilty men were the appeasers, were Chamberlain, were Halifax, were Samuel Hoare, was Sir John Simon. Anyway, Halifax, when Chamberlain raised the issue, said no, he would not consider the position. At that same meeting, according to Winston Churchill, although it's challenged by some historians, Churchill said nothing. That was all he had to do to get the job. The implications of this became evident in Churchill's early appearances in the House of Commons. The Labour ranks cheered him to the rafters. The Conservatives remained conspicuously quiet, reserving their enthusiasm for Neville Chamberlain when he appeared. It was an odd turnabout for Labour, let it be said. Churchill, after a few years as a social reformer before 1914, had swung very substantially to the right of politics and become a big navy man, had become, of course, a Gallipoli man, which wasn't doing him all that good after 1915. As a member of Lloyd George's right-wing coalition government, he had become consumed by anti-communism, had sent British forces to Russia to give futile aid to the opponents of the Bolshevik regime. Thereafter, he declared the British Labour Party to be, quote, unfit to govern. He had acted with great prominence in crushing the general strike in 1926. He'd praised Benito Mussolini as a meritorious opponent of communism, and he'd condemned Mahatma Gandhi in terms that went beyond any form of politeness. Indeed, it was his opposition to the movement in the Conservative Party in the early 1930s to giving a measure of self-government to India, a fairly inadequate measure, which had relegated Churchill to the role of a backbench Conservative, as he had remained throughout the 1930s. But in 1940, as far as Labour was concerned, only one thing mattered about Churchill, that from the mid-30s he had condemned Hitler and German rearmament and German anti-Semitism, that he had warned the British people that appeasement was a calamity, and the Munich settlement, far from being some sort of a triumph, was a defeat without a battle. Now, in 1940, with the war going wretchedly, and giving every promise of going much worse, Churchill was prepared to take the sort of actions which would place the entire population and economy under his war directions. As one minister remarked, complete control over persons and property, not just some persons of some particular class of the community, but of all persons, rich and poor, employer and workman, man or woman, and all property. The person who uttered those words was the new Deputy Prime Minister of Britain, who was Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party. Politics had undergone a small revolution. That was the other attraction of Churchill to the Labour Party. He was prepared to form a true coalition government. That didn't mean that Labour was getting anywhere near half of the ministerial posts, or that all the chief appeasers were getting the boot. But most of the appeasers were being sent to places where they could do no harm. Sir John Simon became Lord Chancellor. Well, he was a great legal man, why not? Sir Samuel Hoare was sent off to Madrid to be nice to General Franco, and Halifax, after a decent interval, was sent to Washington. And Labour did receive some key positions in the government. Attlee, as deputy leader, became, in effect, the leader of the House of Commons because Churchill was very rarely there. Ernest Bevan, Britain's leading trade unionist, but not a member of either House of Parliament, entered the cabinet as Minister of Labour and soon joined the War Cabinet, and eventually a seat was found for him. And Herbert Morrison, the leader of London Labour, was appointed to Minister of Supply and then Minister of Home Security. So in short order, he was creating the National Fire Service, which was to render such support to Britain in the evil days of the Blitz. While Labour and the Liberals welcomed Churchill from the start, the Conservatives were more reserved in their view of him. They might approve him being Prime Minister, but they didn't approve the removal of Neville Chamberlain from the post. So, whereas Labour and the Liberals cheered Churchill when he spoke, the Conservatives cheered Chamberlain, until anyway the day that the British sent their fleet in to dispose of the French Navy, and then the Conservatives cheered as well. Churchill was gradually but steadily creating the position of a national leader. He didn't become leader of the Conservative Party until in October 1940, Neville Chamberlain, who by that time was terminally ill, resigned his position in the Conservatives and resigned from the government and his seat in Parliament. Only then did Churchill become a Conservative leader and a Conservative hero. He'd taken over as a grim time, and he bluntly informed first the Cabinet, then the House of Commons, then the country, "I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears and sweat." Try winning an election in Australia nowadays with a statement like that. Obviously, different times require different appeals. And, of course, the situation was steadily getting worse. Even before the Norwegian campaign was completed, Hitler struck in the West. That was our third major change. On the 10th of May, which was the day on which Churchill became Prime Minister, German troops invaded Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The Western Allies had long anticipated that move. They believed that they were witnessing a rerun of Germany's form of aggression in 1914, a strike in the far north to get around the French defences on the Franco-German border. They couldn't get through the Maginot Line. There's no reason to think they would ever have got through the Maginot Line. I don't know why people are so rude about the Maginot Line. They did what was expected of it. It so discouraged the Germans that they had to come another way. And the Allies had anticipated that. And they had accumulated a large body of troops to go in north, so that the moment Hitler invaded Belgium, the Allies were allowed into Belgium to meet the Germans there. The French were very keen on fighting the war on someone else's territory, which, considering how much of France had been devastated in the First World War, with no compensation because of that awful idea of reparations, how could the French actually think it was a good idea? It was only their territory which had been wrecked. Anyway, they expected the Germans to come through that way. Unfortunately, the Germans weren't playing their game. If you look at the first of the maps that has been distributed to the Sichelschnitt, you'll see what the Germans in fact got up to. In that map, there are 3 German army groups. There's Group C in the north invading Holland and Belgium with 17 divisions. No, with 29 divisions, that's right. Start again. There's Group B in the north with 29 divisions. Much to the south, opposite the Maginot Line, lies German Army Group C with just 17 divisions. But notice in the middle, notice opposite the Ardennes, that German Army Group A with 45 divisions, including 7 panzer divisions, highly mechanised. This wasn't for the Germans going to be 1914 over again at all. The French and British, confident they were fighting a rerun of the First World War, the Schlieffen Plan, moved promptly into Belgium, while on the extreme left, the French 7th Army, which originally had been allotted to stand behind them and act as a general reserve, instead was rushed forward to get to aid of the Dutch, whose resistance collapsed after a matter of 4 days, as I remember. Those forces on the French left wing were British and French troops who were among the pick of the military forces that the Allies had available. They calculated that if they drove into the Germans invading Belgium and Holland, while the Maginot Line remained firm, then the enemy would be in a position where it would simply destroy itself against impregnable fighting forces. Now, those calculations paid no attention to Army Group A with its 45 divisions, including its mobile division placed opposite the Ardennes. French calculations were that in the Ardennes, nature had provided sufficient defence against any enemy trying to act quickly, that with its forests and rivers and valleys, an attacking force would be able to advance only at a snail's pace. So the French had put in the Ardennes elderly soldiers with very little fighting spirit and disgracefully little armament with which to conduct a battle. The Germans advanced through the Ardennes with speed. Somehow all those trees didn't hold up their tanks at all. They crossed the River Meuse in a brilliant manoeuvre. They met what consisted of the French army at Sedan, the scene of a French defeat back in 1870, which filled Frenchmen's heart with dread. As for the British and French forces to their north, the further they advanced into Belgium, the more thoroughly they placed themselves in a trap between the German Army Group B moving directly into them in front and Army Group A coming beneath and behind them. In no time at all, the French and British northern forces, which had expected to command the strategic situation, found themselves simply having to try and get back to an area of security where they could make a stand. The problem was that every time they decided that they would form up at a particular place, they would find that the Germans had got there before them. The Allies' dominant conclusion was that the enemy, having got through the Ardennes, would then swing south, clear of the Maginot Line, and head for Paris. Again, they miscalculated. Instead, the Germans, after breaking through the Ardennes and crushing the opposition at Sedan, drove direct to the sea. When they reached there, they had split the Allied armies in two and were in a position where they could deal with them one at a time. The British and the French in the north were simply forced back. And at that point, Lord Gort, who was the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, made a momentous decision. Up to that point, he'd been conducting himself very much like a commander on the ground, and certainly like a servant of the French High Command. Now he realised that he had a larger responsibility to his army as a whole. If his army was to avoid death or captivity, it must depart the continent in short order. So he proposed to the British government that he put his mind to evacuating the British army from the continent. That caused no little amazement to Churchill's government, but not the sort of amazement which would cause them to disregard it. The events by which the British army fell back on Dunkirk and with great difficulty and courage were spirited away to Britain, mainly by the official British fleet, but in the last stages by large numbers of small boats being directed by private enterprise captains, was to the British a miraculous event of deliverance. to which they will still refer. To the French, of course, it was a not uncharacteristic act of betrayal by the British, who cleared out the moment the going got tough and left them to do their best. But there's much to be said for both these points of view, in fact. But it is also a fact that the collapse of France was plainly the consequence of much larger circumstances than where the British Army was going. And if French fell apart with the British Army still on the continent, that would significantly reduce the determination of the British to keep on fighting when the whole situation had gone wrong. The progress of France's calamity at this stage, it seems to me, moves at this point from the military to the political, as the Germans, now striking south, overwhelmed the French military resistance on the Somme. The structure of France's wartime government rapidly disintegrated. The overwhelming question was, what would the French do next as the Germans were bearing down on Paris? Would they continue fighting, or would they throw in the towel? Well, Churchill had no doubt what the French should do, and he announced in a very dramatic moment that at this point France and Britain would become a single nation, and that they would continue fighting against Germany, even if it meant that the French element of them would have to retreat to the Pyrenees or to North Africa or even across the Channel. Now, that wasn't just a British answer. It calls to mind very strongly the behaviour of one of the people who was most important in French history in the first half of the 20th century, Georges Clemenceau, who was the leader of France in the last years of the First World War. Clemenceau, in mid-1918, with the French apparently facing catastrophe, had stated, "The Germans may take Paris, but that will not prevent me from going on with the war. We will fight on the Loire, we will fight on the Garonne, we will fight even on the Pyrenees. And if at last we are driven off the Pyrenees, we will continue the war at sea. But as for asking for peace, jamais, never." But the man who had emerged to political dominance in France at this point was no Clemenceau. Marshal Pétain was remembered, of course, as a hero of the First World War, the man of Verdun, the man who had healed the French army following the mutinies of 1917. But he was not a man of the French Revolution. He was not a man devoted to French anti-clericalism or a devotee of liberty, equality and fraternity. He loathed the democracy of the Third Republic. He embraced autocratic Catholicism as a system of belief, though from the many stories that emerges about the number of ladies who shared his bed, obviously not someone who thought he must practice himself, he felt entirely at home as French ambassador in Madrid, where, of course, he was meeting General Franco, who had already carried out his right-wing revolution in Spain. It might be horrible for Pétain, and I'm sure it was, to confront a situation in which the German army had triumphed over France. But it would have its compensations, a great opportunity to bring to an end the monstrosities of French liberalism and the French Revolution, the horrors of what he saw as neo-pacifist, Jew-dominated elected governments, the whole system of electing a government. The government giving no attention to ideas at school of reading and study, instead placing great emphasis among school children on physical fitness and their duty to submit to the authority of parents, of church, of state. That line of thought, of course, rejected any notion of an absentee French government keeping up France's resistance to Germany from Britain or North Africa. And it placed the position of the powerful French fleet in a state of threatening ambiguity. Churchill and the British could do nothing about France's political response to this catastrophe. It was beyond their power to intervene, but they could do something about the state of the French fleet. Either it must place itself out of the possibility of fighting alongside the Germans by sailing into British harbours, or at least into the harbours of a neutral power, or by scuttling itself. But it must do one of these, or else. The French fleet replied that they would not consider these choices. They were prepared to offer an assurance that that fleet would never be placed in German hands, but they were unable to show how they could carry that out in face of their conquerors. Churchill wasn't prepared to take the chance. In July 1914, the British sank the bulk of the French fleet. That great wartime alliance, which went back to the Entente of 1903 and had been the dominant force in European affairs ever since, was now well and truly at an end. Britain, in other words, was on its own. It could choose one of two courses. Hitler, contrary to the frequent claim that is made for him, did not offer British any terms of negotiation. He simply told it, speaking as a victor power, that it would be silly for the British to go on fighting. That held out to the British the possibility of a retreat from war, but therefore a retreat to a position of capitulation to a superior military force. It might thereby be asked to capitulate to terms less humiliating than those being imposed on the French, but these would be plainly a large withdrawal by Britain from the position of independence and defiance which it had adopted when the Germans invaded Poland. Alternately, it could opt for a continuation of the war, which by any standards would be an unwelcome event and in decidedly unfavourable circumstances. Well, as long as Churchill remained Prime Minister, there wasn't any question what Britain's answer would be. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We will never surrender. But other words were being uttered in Britain at this time. Lord Halifax was still Foreign Minister. He was no sympathiser with the Nazis and he was no coward. But he could see no way in which Britain unassisted could win this war. And he perceived terrible consequences for Britain if it remained in a state of unsupported conflict against Germany. What he wanted most of all was to preserve that Anglican, rurified, socially delineated Britain of his youth. And if it could only be accompanied by negotiations with Hitler, then the nation should be prepared to negotiate. For a succession of days in late May 1940, the British government argued, or did it agonise, over this issue. But in the end, the five-man war cabinet reached a definite conclusion. Churchill was firm, no surrender. Attlee and Greenwood, the Labour representatives in the War Cabinet, took the same line, no surrender. But so also did Neville Chamberlain, who, having been humiliated by Hitler once, was determined never to believe him again. Halifax could have resigned and sought to form an opposition. Instead, he fell into line. So the war would go on. The initiative thereupon transferred to the Germans. What were they going to do next? That obviously they never considered this possibility. They never considered that they would overrun France in 6 weeks. That miraculous amount of time in which it took them to launch their assault in the west and carry it through to complete victory. They could choose to refrain from troubling Britain further, make it clear that they would go on building up their armaments, exercise their now extensive control of the continent of Europe, plan for the war that Hitler was aching for against the Soviet Union, and wait for the British to fall into a state of reasonableness. Alternatively, they could set out to invade Britain, launching a great cross-channel military endeavour preceded by a sustained attack from the air on the Royal Air Force, and then also from the air on the British fleet. Or, thirdly, they could go along with a view that had prevailed for much of the 1920s and 30s. The victory in war no longer required armies except to occupy already conquered territory. A sustained attack from the air would devastate the munitions factories specifically, the British economy generally, and the homes and morale of the British population. Hitler clearly was not interested in the first alternative of leaving the British to get on with their little lives while he attended to becoming master of the continent. On the contrary, Hitler adopted the position that Britain must accept a large diminution in the country's powers or be rapidly eliminated, just as the French had been. The only question was what form this blitzkrieg would take. A full-scale invasion of Britain to which assault from the air would be a prelude, or the devastation of Britain by a strategic bombing campaign. Hitler, without quite making up his mind, nevertheless moved to a somewhat mixed conclusion. Germany would assemble on the coast of France the manpower of an invading army, and it would assemble on the coast of France the Rhine barges that would carry them across the Channel. Hopefully, the German Navy, which had been much depleted during the Norwegian campaign, would be able to safeguard them. And first of all, he would assemble the Luftwaffe to begin the process of invasion by an air campaign waged just against the Royal Air Force. Not a war against the British people, just against its aircraft. About its aircraft in the air or on the ground, its aerodrome, its radar stations, which were, of course, one of the great things that the British had at this time, which would give them such an advantage in facing the Germans, against its communication centres and against its aircraft manufacturing industry. So, at the end of July 1940, Hitler set about implementing this policy. The air assault on Britain, he instructed, would start immediately. If its results were not satisfactory, then preparations would cease. But, and I quote, "if we gain the impression that the English are being crushed and that the air war is, after a certain time, taking effect, then we shall attack." The date for the military invasion, if it were to follow, would be the 15th of September. What all this shows is that in the 6 weeks from mid-August, the air assault on Britain was not intended as an independent Luftwaffe action, which would reduce Britain to a state of impotence through strategic bombing. It was intended as a distinct and planned preparation for a full invasion. Hitler, in a memo of August, laid down the purpose of just this first stage, and I quote, "The German Air Force will use all available means to destroy the British Air Force as soon as possible. Attacks will be directed primarily against the flying units, ground organisation and supplies installations of the RAF, and further against the air armaments industry, including factories producing anti-aircraft equipment." Now, it may be that Goering, who was head of the Air Force, drawing wildly exaggerated conclusions concerning the effectiveness of the RAF in destroying RAF units, the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe in destroying RAF uniforms, reached a somewhat different conclusion, that an invasion would not be necessary because the bare air battle alone would destroy the British will to go on fighting. But there's no real evidence that Hitler endorsed this conclusion, and it's clear that the ultimate decision rested with Hitler, not with Goering. Quite early, the Luftwaffe, in those opening weeks of waging war only against the RAF, not against British industry or exports or morale, was attempting to achieve this single purpose, rendering the Royal Air Force inoperative, so that they could then render the British fleet inoperative in the Channel, and so get the troops and the barges across to England. On the 15th of August, Goering started the offensive, employing 800 bombers and 1,150 fighters. Despite the setbacks that followed, by the end of August, the Luftwaffe remained overall optimistic. Although the fierce opposition of the British fighters was acknowledged, the Luftwaffe still considered that the RAF had been seriously damaged and its striking force considerably weakened, and he was reinforced in this view by the reports he was receiving from his pilots of the number of British aeroplanes that they had shot down. It is clear now that those reports were wildly exaggerated. But it isn't a miscalculation that was peculiar to the Germans. The RAF had, from early in the war, been giving exaggerated accounts of how successful they were in encounters against the enemy. However, these two pieces of information didn't add up to the same results. After all, the RAF, before the war, had wildly exaggerated the size of the German Air Force. Encouraged in this view, it must be said, by information from Winston Churchill, who always took the worst view of the strength of German air forces. Hence, if they were now exaggerating the number of German aircraft that they were shooting down, they were probably getting somewhere near the right number of how many aircraft the Germans could now put in the air. The Germans, on the other hand, had always underestimated the size of the RAF when the war broke out, and they were now underestimating the capacity of the British munitions factory to provide the RAF with new aeroplanes and new pilots. So, in that sense, Goebbels' misjudgment about the casualties he was inflicting on the British may have been significantly important. That's one explanation for the next stage of the Battle of Britain. On the 7th of September, completely unanticipated by the RAF, the Germans dispatched in daytime a huge air fleet, not against the British aerodromes, but against London. It was a devastating raid because the defending aircraft were all in other parts of the country, expecting the Germans to come once more for their aerodromes. With little British resistance, the Germans set the east end of London on fire so thoroughly that when night fell and the Germans sent another lot of raiders across, they didn't have any difficulty finding their target. It was burning so brightly. Now, arguably, that's a clear view that the Germans saw victory in sight, and that just another good hammering of the British capital would cause the British to throw in the towel. But as so often in history, another explanation is equally tenable. That already by the 7th of September, the German command recognised that the losses they were suffering at the hands of the RAF were simply too severe to facilitate a naval crossing of the Channel. Whether I'll ever find out which is the correct explanation, I don't know, because my German is not one of my stronger points. Was that week, beginning on the 7th of September, an attempt to bring the battle to a climax, or was it an attempt to change Germany's answer to what they would do next? No, they wouldn't try to invade Britain. They'd smash it into submission by bombing from the air. Well, what strikes me as most evident is that if the Germans felt that they were coming near to winning the war in the air, and so could even carry out an invasion, or not need to carry out an invasion because they would have won anyway, they were sadly deluded. There were still the great battleships and the horde of destroyers down in the Channel. Could the German aircraft really polish all of them off? And how many British destroyers did you need to get all those Rhine barges to make a river crossing? Whoever thought of getting across the English Channel as a river crossing was a person seriously deluded, as I can assure you from experience. And they were simply forgetting that the Luftwaffe, far from defeating the RAF, had in large measure not yet encountered it. And if you look at that second map I gave you, you'll see why. England is divided into 4 sections: 10, 11, 12, 13. The 10-1 is in southern England away from London. The 11-1 is in southern England near London. 12 is in the Midlands. 13 is further north. German aircraft could only fly as far as London. So it's only Sector 11 that they've been fighting against. Sector 11, of course, was commanded by a New Zealander, Sir Keith Park, whom a recent book on the air defence of Britain gives the principal marks to, ahead of Churchill, ahead of Dowding, ahead of the great inventors, as the man who decided the Battle of Britain. That Park never lost his nerve, that he kept going, that he held the whole thing together and he won the battle. This, of course, is strongly against the delusions of people like Lee Mallory, who was in command of Sector 12, who wanted to fight the whole battle differently. But I think the argument definitely rests with Park. But it was Sector 11 that was doing most of the fighting. If things got really desperate, then he'd call in elements from Sector 12. But there's a large element of the British Air Force which is never fighting in this battle. Sector 12 only fought one really serious battle when the Germans, in a moment of madness, tried to bomb the Midlands from Norway. And because they thought the British would never catch on to this until it was too late, didn't send any fighters to protect their bombers, which as a result were chewed up by the RAF with great alarm. It's simply the case that far from the Battle of Britain being a close-run thing, as we like to think of it, and it makes it that much more exciting if we do think of it, that the Germans were never fighting more than about a third of the British fighters, and that if they'd really got on top of Sector 11, then those areas further away from German petrol supply, the petrol that put the German planes into the air, that those other sectors of the RAF would be called in to carry on with the good work. And if they could not do that, then they would simply lose. So what follows, if not from the 7th of September, then certainly from the middle of September, is no longer the Battle of Britain. That is the German attempt to crush the British Air Force. It is the Blitz. It's when the Germans turn their aircraft against British cities and factories and homes, those large areas that they keep bombing, particularly London, which they bomb every night except one in a spate of 56 days. London was the one that was most regularly bombed. But of course, as we know, in November 1940, they subjected Coventry to atrocious devastation. Although I have to say it was devastation which knocked off that marvellous cathedral. But they somehow didn't get the aircraft factories in Coventry, which from one point of view is a tragedy, and from another is just what you'd want. So the major ports and industrial centres of Britain suffered severely. this is the period when John Strachey, Labour MP and once a devotee but no longer of the Soviet Union, dug for Mrs. Miller in a very graphic document. This is the time when the common people of Britain are suffering. But it's never a time when the Germans could win the war. They never had the Air Force. They had an Air Force that worked with their army. They had dive bombers which went ahead of their army and plastered the area just out of army range. And so the Germans managed to push forward. But the Air Force is always an element of a military force down on the ground, which is all those trained troops and all those elements of big Berthas and huge guns. As an Air Force that could on its own win the war, it doesn't exist. The Germans are never going to win the Blitz. If they haven't won the Battle of Britain, then clearly they've lost. So, to sum up, where by the end of 1940 does the war stand? Germany, we need to remember, dominated the whole of Western and Central Europe, including France, Britain's major ally. Britain had lost all its allies, was suffering heavy and continuing damage. But its pre-war preparations, its geographical position, its steadfast resistance had rendered an invasion impossible, and the Germans simply did not have the airport to bomb it into submission. Churchill, in a famous utterance of mid-1940, said, "Hitler knows that he must defeat us in this island or lose the war." Well, Hitler had not defeated us in this island, but he can hardly have felt, looking at the rest of Europe, that the war was lost. Yes.
Questions for Trevor, please. Don't be shy.
We've heard about the differences of opinion in the House of Commons and within the government about the war. What about the people of Britain? Were they in favour of Neville Chamberlain's, what do you call it, appeasement? Did they support the war when it happened, or did they want to withdraw from the war? What about the general population?
I know. It is, of course, the hardest question to ask. We know something about the House of Commons because it was their job to get up and talk, We know something about what the government did from what it did, but what does the general population feel? All I can say is that the government was making great efforts to find what the common people were thinking. And the conclusion always comes back that the population is prepared to go on with the war. And the worse the German atrocities become, the more determined they are to go on with the war. Now, I guess you always know that's the case, that if you're attacking a country, it's going to respond to your attacks by a heightened level of resistance. But is the point going to become when they can no longer keep that resistance going? Everyone says, the British bombing campaign against Germany was stupid. We know that because we'd had the Blitz against Britain. But the Blitz against Britain was a sufficiently small-scale thing that you could say, British resistance will last beyond this much, but you're going to reach a point where the resistance is going to collapse. And that was a point which the British bombing campaign had to find out. And I expect that the German bombing, the American bombing campaign against Japan had to find out. And before we conclude too easily, the bombing campaigns never reduce a country to the willingness to surrender. Let me remind you, there was an atomic bomb and a very swift end to a war which people thought was going to go on for many weeks before the Japanese would get the message. So that's not quite an answer, but it's the best I can do from the information we have.
Yes, I find this whole thing very depressing. The causes of war, these are highly intelligent nations, two nations, Britain and Germany, bombing the shit out of each other. The cause of the war was the stupid economists. When unemployment in Germany reached 40%, the German people democratically elected Adolf Hitler to be the Prime Minister, whatever it was. So the cause of the war lies with the stupid economists. They knew this, or they were told the solution by John Maynard Keynes, but they took no notice.
Well,
it's very depressing.
I guess I wouldn't say that the high level of unemployment can be solely accused of responsibility for the war. After all, countries can do things in response to unemployment. They can vote out the government and bring in Franklin D. Roosevelt, or they can bring in the Labour Party. They can swing left, in other words. You've got a particular German problem when you see a country swinging right in face of this. I agree, unemployment is going to make things worse. And as long as you've got countries that may go left or may go right, you better be careful. Nobody, I mean, the German communists are, of course, the great patsy in this. They were delighted when Hitler took over, because they knew he wouldn't last 5 minutes. They'd have a few minutes of his solution, and then the common man would rise up and throw out the government and bring in a communist regime, and all would be beautiful. It was a miscalculation of which they paid with their lives. But it is obviously the case that in a situation of bad unemployment, some people just sit down and take it, as the British did. They didn't throw over their Conservative government. They kept on with it, and when things got a bit better, they cheered it on. And when things got a bit worse, they tightened their belts and said, we'll just have to endure it. The Americans were more radical. They voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was the New Deal was at least an improvement on what they've been getting from the Republicans. But as you say, the Germans went to Adolf Hitler. So you better not mess around with unemployment if you want things to stay as they are. I do agree with you, yes.
I suppose the phony war really ended in May 1940, but I think two rather remarkable developments in that short period were the build-up of the RAF strength in fighters under Beaverbrook, and perhaps more far-reaching, the developments at Bletchley Park, which led to the British knowing what the Germans were going to do in many cases, which had impact also in Russia when they came into the war through the Cambridge 5 spies. I was surprised
Yes.
to find the Battle of Kursk, the great tank battle. The Russians had access to some of the ultra information which one of the spies had leaked to them, so that before the battle they were able to destroy a lot of the Luftwaffe and get improved armaments for their fight the tanks. I just wonder if you could comment on if the start of the war had been later than September 1939, possibly it might have been not so difficult for Germany to have overcome these forces in the West.
Why do you think that? I think Britain was rearming at this time more than the Germans were.
But if they hadn't had access to what they obtained through Ultra and under Beaverbrook, tremendous force for building up the RAF fighters.
Well, many people would say that the build-up in the RAF was going on before Beaverbrook took over, and that he gave it publicity and he gave it the sense of a personality that was there, and people took in their saucepans to build a Spitfire. People in authority didn't know what the hell to do with these saucepans because they weren't really any use to that. I'm not denigrating Beaverbrook because I think people do need that sort of display, but I suspect that the construction, the key things are things like the construction of the Spitfire and the other one. Hurricane, thank you, yes. I have a programme on it arguing that it was the key weapon of the Battle of Britain, not the Spitfire. There's actually someone who believes it, yes, well. But you know, the British have started building these from about 1936-37, and the number is becoming significant by 1940. And then you bring in Churchill, and so you bring in Beaverbrook, and you see you've got a government that really cares about these things. Neville Chamberlain could never somehow convince the country that he was doing a lot, even when he was, because he so obviously had cared for appeasement, for making terms with Hitler, for seeing what was moving Hitler, and he was the man who was going to bring it all right. And when it all went wrong, he could never convince people that he'd undergone a great change. In fact, I think he devoutedly loathed Hitler because he'd so obviously been lied to. But he just didn't have that ability to convey it to the country. Perhaps if you've got something as badly wrong as Chamberlain did, you can never convince people you're getting it all right. I'm not sure about that. I don't know that ultra was really important to the British until about 42 or 43. I think until that time, the sort of information they were getting from the Germans, it didn't matter that they knew. They couldn't damn well do anything about it. I mean, they certainly were getting information that Russia was going to be invaded, and they would convey this to Stalin, and Stalin would say, I know all about you, capitalist swine, you're just trying to get me in a war with Germany. Not a bit of it. Even when his own commanders, when his own spy in Tokyo sent him information about this, he didn't respond. He thought he'd done something so clever in 1939 when he'd switched over so conspicuously from being anti-German to being pro-German. He thought he could go on like that for as long as he chose. And so, you know, with all they knew from ultra and other means, it didn't make any difference to Stalin. He just kept on believing it and was absolutely shattered when Hitler turned on him and more or less offered his resignation. And they said, no, you get back in there. You've made it, you better fix it now. Yes. Just a point of information. What is ultra? Ultra is the means of interpreting the German codes, which they had been reading from early in the war because the Poles had got hold of a copy of the German code decoding machine, and they made it available to the French and then to the British. And the British were using it all the war. And it was giving them, it would in turn be giving them very valuable information, particularly at sea. I happen to know this because Harry Hensley was a bit of a mate of mine, and he was the young Oxford student who was put in charge of the whole naval decode, which was quite amazing. And there they were getting from the Germans where their submarines were going to be waiting for the British convoys. So what they would then do would arrange that one of them would spot the German convoy and then redirect the convoy. Spot the German U-boats waiting for the convoys, yes. But they always did it in a way that the Germans never realised that their code was being read. And it wasn't until something like 1976 that someone let it out.
Wasn't it called Enigma?
Yes.
Enigma was the German code machine.
Enigma was the German code machine, yes. Ultra was the... Peter, you know more about this than I.
I think Ultra is the name of the Bletchley Park
Yeah,
operation.
yes.
Does that make sense?
I think it does make sense, yes.
Could I make a... Is this on or not? Don't seem to be getting much noise.
I'm hearing you quite well.
Can anyone else hear me?
Yes.
Well, if you go to Bletchley Park, they now answer the question, must occur to a lot of people. If you have a whole lot of code breakers sitting down breaking code, and you do it about midday, what do you do about it? You've got this huge stack of coded messages to decode.
Yes.
the people at Bletchley will tell you what, the British decoding machine was identical to the German one.
Yeah.
The software was different, so you had to know how to wire up the wheels.
Yes.
So the Bletchley Park placed an order about 4,500 of these things, took them aside, rewired the wheels to the German spec. So the moment they got the German coding information, they had all these girls sitting down busy decoding the messages.
One of whom became Mrs. Hinsley, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, it's an interesting point. And there was always that problem. There would always be a lapse in time between you getting the message and getting it decoded, and that might be a day too late. But it was when something like the naval codes became available to them, and the U-boats were sent to wait for the convoys, that gave the British enough time to tell the convoys, we're just going to spot a German submarine, and when we've done that, you change your direction to avoid it. So the interesting thing is the Germans never caught on that their road code was being broken. Is that right? I've heard it said that the extra code was not because any German knew they were being...
Donitz was a bright lad. He was very suspicious about this.
I see. Well, yeah, difference between experts. Okay, lovely.
I always complain that the job of giving the vote of thanks is the hardest part of being president, and probably the hardest part of my life. And I'm not quite sure where to start tonight. But suffice to say that you have treated us to an extraordinary delivery this evening. I guess my view is that, simple though it may be, what an extraordinary culmination of past political events, World War I, changes in technology, changes in warfare, changes in the character of people who were leading the armed forces, the politicians, the press, and altogether, what an extraordinary combination, and what a topic for you to be able to devote your research time to. And thanks for sharing that with us.
I enjoy this part.